Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to be looking at new decks, new kind of revisions to popular decks in Standard with the release of Aetherdrift. So we'll get back to the regular kind of cadence of best decks video, but it's really been a few days now since the sets come out. People are still trying out stuff. I will preface by saying, if you've been running Gruul Mice, if you've been running Domain, if you've been running the various bounce decks, they're still very, very effective. We're not going to cover those because there's very minimal changes to them. There's like the Momentum Breaker, for example, in Bounce, or they switched it's like Ride Down, I think it is, in Domain, the cost reduction white exile effect. So just kind of like minor things there. What I want to focus on with this video is we're going to look at recent MTGO leagues to see some new decks, new ideas people are trying out with the set. And then I kind of curated some lists from Untapped to see what's working there. So to give you an idea of things to kind of consider, usually once it hits the 7-day mark, so around Tuesday, we can get a bigger data set from Untapped, and I can start seeing win rates and stuff like that to give you a little bit more of an informed detail. But again, this is going to be standard best of 3. The best of 1, I took a look. It's like mainly mono red for the most part. So we're going to kind of wait for more data to pull in and see what's happening there. For the Untapped giveaway, I will do it on Sunday. So the original video I posted on Standard, giving away 10 codes. Drop in a comment there. We got a lot of snow here in Canada, like a lot of snow. So I've been shoveling for like the last 3 days, just trying to catch up. But anyways, we're going to jump into it. So from MTG decks, we have a win rate matrix from the last 15 days. So a little of this is inflated because it is pre. We don't have a pure cutoff of just Aetherdrift, but you see in terms of volume of games played, Gruul aggro, the bounce decks are very high. Golgari's still played quite a bit, but not the best win rate. The Overlords decks performing really well. We've had an increase in Delirium decks, and we'll take a look. There's the new exhaust cards that came out that have really kind of given the deck a different angle of attack. But kind of going down, we see like red deck, Convoke's had an uptick, just they got better mana and a new 1-drop artifact. Your Oculus decks, now they have access to Spell Pierce. The Cage decks have kind of mixed results, but they did get kind of a toolbox shell with the Gear Hulk that we'll take a look at through the games there. The Omni deck has kind of fallen, but we're going to take a look. No particular order. These are decks that have done well in either leagues or just volume of games on the ladder. So the first deck, and I'll paste these and timestamp them anyways, so you can copy them. So it is Izzet Repurpose. It's an artifact combo deck. It is 5-0 from Death Note 1999. And this is your Lotus deck. So Radiant Lotus. You could sacrifice 1 or more artifacts. Choose a color. Target player adds 3 mana for chosen color for each artifact sacked this way. So it generates a whole bunch of mana. And basically what you're trying to do with this deck here is have a bunch of cheap artifacts in play. You cast the Boomobile, and then you can exhaust the Boomobile. So 3x, when it enters, it also generates 4 mana. So this deals 20 damage to any target. So what you're basically able to do is use the mana from the Radiant Lotus to 20-ball your opponent, whatever it may be. So this deck here, you have like Memory Guardian as a cheap affinity threat, Pit Automaton. It's an artifact that can also add mana for activated abilities. The Boomobile is your win condition. Brass Tunnel Grinder helps you dig into the combo. Collector's Vault creates artifacts as well as draws discards. Detective Satchel comes in, makes you 3 artifacts, which is nice. So just more fodder. So this comes in and then could effectively generate you 9 mana. Legion Extruder is a removal spell that then leaves an artifact behind. Can also transform your artifacts there. You sack them. You get a 3/3 instead. Heaped Harvest here. This one is, now it seems odd because there's no green mana in the deck. But you're using this with conjunction of Repurposing Bay. So this lets you basically Birthing Pod artifacts. So you can sack this, sack a 2-drop, find Heaped Harvest, find a land, then sack this, then find another land. And it gains you some life potentially as well if you just sack it for its face value. Chainsaw, very similar to Extruder. Removal, that can then be sacked. Then you have Simulacrum Synthesizer. You can tutor for this. and then just make a lot of big creatures. So it gives you another kind of win condition, Enigma Jewel around the activated ability costs, and then Mightstone, Meekstone as a way to have removal or card advantage. You have Forging the Anchors, another way to get some card advantage in the deck. Brotherhood's End as a sweeper, Defabricate as a stifle effect or counter target artifact or enchantment, so it gives you some flexibility there. Spell Pierce, cheap disruption, Barrage, cheap removal, Spyglass, activated abilities, Filigree Silex as kind of a sweeper effect, tokens, low to the ground stuff. Another Mightstone, Meekstone can deal with Shieldred, bigger things, and also card advantage. Torch is cheap removal. Urbrass Forge, another way to kind of win the game if they say deal with the Boommobile or they're gaining a lot of life type thing, and then Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate. We then have Izzet Prowess, so 5/0 from TSP Gendrick, and this is a tempo deck. So you have Emberheart Challenger, Swift Spears, and Slick Shots, along with Mockingbird that can copy any of your creatures. Shore Up as protection. You have bounce effects into the Floodmaw, Monstrous Rage, Slick Sequence as basically a deal 2 that could potentially draw you a card. Burst Lightning is burn, Opt is hand, just basically cycling effects. Draw cards, replace themselves, more prowess triggers, Storm Chaser's Talent in here. The big thing that makes this deck playable now is River, Pyre, Verge. Just having more untapped dual lines is very important in these types of decks. Into the Floodmaw as cheap bounce, Lithomantic Barrage for bigger things, Ral for the grindier heavy removal matchups. Full Force Spell Pierce, another cheap interaction spell. Hits like their various counter or big sweepers, big non-creature spells, or even just cheap removal 1-for-1 in these kind of low mana mirrors. Torch and Witchstalker as more cheap removal. We then have Gruul Delirium. So there's a couple slight varied versions. This one is from Hayseed. There's a version that I put a full video out. We did 3 matches. We played against Mono Red, we played against Esper Bounce, and we played against Demir Midrange with it. That one was a list that came from a 500-person Japanese tournament. That one or came in second place from 500 people. So that gameplay's out there. The main difference with this one is it's playing Llanowar Elves in the main. But the change in this from like the version, say, that I played for like my RCQ that was more with Wildfire Wickerfolk and more all in on the graveyard. This version here is playing 2 exhaust creatures in Draconautics Engineer. So it gives your other creatures haste and puts a counter on your Draconautics and can be exhausted to create a 4/4 dragon. But with this one here, you're playing Afterburner Expert. 3 mana, 4/2. And then the big thing with this, it can come back from your graveyard. As long as you do any exhaust ability, it just comes back from the graveyard to the battlefield, which is very strong. You can play it with the Draconautics Engineer, and then it comes back into play and it gets haste because of the Draconautics Engineer, which is a very strong, just like 4/2 haste out of nowhere. Llanowar helps you kind of ramp into that. I didn't love NT in the list. I found it a little awkward at times, just milling over, but you didn't have the effects. It does play nicely with the Afterburner though, given that you get the trample on a larger body. Otherwise, at times it does get chunked by smaller things. I would say I did miss a little bit of the haste of the deck. Wildfire Wickerfolk, just kind of punching in. There's the new artifact vehicle, the 3 mana 4/2 haste trample becomes a creature when it comes into play, and you can discard a card from your hand to return it from the graveyard with a finality counter. That one was something I wanted to try out in the list as well, along with Chandra, and the sideboard was something that was interesting. But your FOMOs, Patchwork Beasties kind of mixed in. Seed of Hope mills you over, Torch the Tower. I will say this version is better used for Torch the Tower because you have more bargain fodder, particularly in Dredger's Insight. So 2 mana, whenever an artifact or creature leaves your graveyard, you gain a life. And then when it enters, it mills 4. You can return an artifact, creature, or land to your hand that was milled this way. So another way to fill your graveyard. That is an enchantment for your types. That is an enchantment that can be bargained. This version's on 2 Ren. The one thing as well, with 21 lands, I found it a bit awkward having 4 tap lands between 3 Restless Ridgeline and the Commercial District in a mana base that's looking to curve out really. Like, you want Elf on 1, you want as many untapped lines. I found it a little awkward. I ended up cutting the Commercial District for a second mountain. Nemesis for the red decks, Lithomantic Barrage for the bigger things, blue-white, Beza, stuff like that against your Oculus decks. Pop Patch Formation, Flying, Enchantment Hate, Pyroclasm for the go-wide decks that are smaller, Throwback, Graveyard Hate, Enchantment Hate, Life Gain, and then Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate. We then go to Izzet, they're calling it Izzet Ral, but it's really Izzet kind of Monument. So Monument of Endurance, 3 mana artifact. Whenever you discard a card, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. You draw a card, you create a treasure, or each opponent loses 3 life. So what you're trying to do with this deck is use things like Artist's Talent. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you discard a card. If you do, draw. So this one's not necessarily let's play everything with cycling or whatever it is. Instead, it's kind of a Izzet control deck using the Monument as a win condition. And this triggers on both players' turns, so you get like 3 instances on your turn, potentially 3 on your opponent's. Thundertrap Trainer helps you find cards. Opt for cheap kind of cycling effects. Burst Lightning, Torch Towers removal. This town ain't big enough with the Storm Chaser's Talent combo. You have Sleight of Hand, Stock Up as another way, kind of a curate style effect. Look at the top 5, put 2 into your hand, so just a better divination. And then Roaring Furnace as more removal. Ral as another way. You could go -3, draw 3, discard 2, get 2 triggers off the Monument as well. Another deck that takes advantage of the new River Pyre Verge. And then another Ral for the Grindier matchups, negates for cheap counters, Maze Mind Tomes for the Grindier matchups, just gives you some card advantage. Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate, Spell Pierce, Cheap Disruption, Scorching Shot as removal, Pyroclasm, go wide, small decks. And then look at this gem. Calarona Coral Tyrant, 2 mana, 0/8. Yes, that's it. That's the card. Good luck aggro decks trying to pump through a 8 toughness. So just buys you a lot of turns. This thing can like soak up a bunch of damage. Even like Monstrous Rage at times might not be able to push through if they don't have double strike. We have Orzhov Sacrifice. This one went 5-0 by Artifacts. So this is a version of a Raise Past deck. We have a new card in Zahur, Glory's Past. 2 mana, 3/2, start your engines. So you get speed going. You can sacrifice another creature, surveil 1, activate only once per turn. So you don't get the full kind of sack your whole board effect. But once you have max speed, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you create a 2/2. So nice way to kind of fill your yard, get some bodies, just replace themselves, kind of trade off. The rest of the deck is looking to put cards into your graveyard to eventually raise past and get them all in. Bartholomew lets you sack a whole bunch of stuff, put counters. Ilias Core gains your life when it comes in and then loses your opponent life when the creatures die. Gas Guzzler is another speed enabler. And then you can sacrifice creatures to draw a card. No limitation in the amount of times you can do it, but another card advantage engine. Gnawing Vermin mills you into creatures, can be potentially removal. Infestation Sage, again, just multiple bodies. Snarling Gorehound helps you mill over. The Blood Witch is another card that gains and drains. You have Quag Feast here, so choose target creature, planeswalker, or vehicle. You mill 2, then destroy the permanent if the mana value is less than or equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. So just removal that helps you mill. Dewdrop Cure as a reanimation effect. Another deck that we got the Verge now for Orzhov. Hand Hate, cheap removal, and Espa Spite against the aggressive decks. You have Authority of the Console, Graveyard Hate, and Soul Guide Lantern. Quag Feast, just more removal. Dewdrop Cure as just more reanimation, cheap effects, and Destroy Evil for Enchantment Hate, as well as Big Creature Hate. So kind of continuing on, this is from Untapped. We have 63 games, 73% for Boros Convoke. So you have access now to Sunbillow Verge, which is big for this deck. The Jeskai versions, the mana base was very painful and somewhat inconsistent. You also don't need to play blue anymore necessarily because you have Nesting Bot. So a new artifact that came out, this is effectively 2 bodies, gives you another artifact that you can target with Gleeful Demolition, which is nice. So this is start your engines. When it dies, you get to create another servo token, and then at max speed, it becomes a 2/1. So you have basically your Convoke Shell. You're playing 2 War Leaders Call, 3 Sanguines, a full set of Myrex in here for Grindier advantage. Cases as some more removal, so more akin to the traditional Boros Convoke, given that we have another 1-drop enabler. Your sideboard for like the mirror kind of decks, Torch Tower, cheap removal, can destroy evil for the bigger mana, control-y decks, your domains, just ways to kind of hit sweepers, Invasion of Gobokan, Graveyard Hate and Rest in Peace. Against mono red, you have Sheltered by Ghost, and the grindier matchups, you have Grass 4. We then have Gruul Goblins. This one's at 65% after 82 games. A base red deck, but it's using the Exhaust package with Afterburner Expert as well. Agatha Soul Cauldron takes advantage of the activated abilities, most notably things like Krenko, where you're able to give any of your goblins a Krenko ability, which is very strong. So it just makes you more goblins. House Squad Heavy can also, if you have at max speed, make each of your goblins tap for mana equal to the number of goblins you control. It's a Rabble Master effect as well, giving you a creature each turn, and then also gives your other goblins haste. Dropkick Bomber is another lord that gives you an ability to give one of your goblins flying, and it sacks. Afterburner, we mentioned, it has the exhaust ability, same as Draconics Engineer. Ruvenwald is a lord that replaces creatures. Seer Slicer makes you a bunch of goblins. And then you have things like Burnout, Bastronaut. So you have like a speed package. This gets double strike with speed. Firebrand can be removal. Gives all your creatures the same ability of pinging. So a lot of activated abilities. You can give like any of your creatures with a counter the ability to get 1+1/0. The goblin here is another exhaust effect. So with exhaust under Cauldron, each of your creatures get the exhaust ability, but it is still limited in terms of 1 activation per creature with the counters. You also have Soulstone in here, which counts as goblins. Lithomantic Barrage is going to be cheap removal. Again, Torch, more Cauldrons for Graveyard Hate, Paw Patch, Enchantment Hate, Flying Hate, Case for the grindier matchups, Nemesis for the red matchups, Witchstalker Frenzy for some bigger removal. We then go to Insidious Roots, 4 colors. So this deck here is a base Golgari deck with access to Ketramos, a new card. So Ketramos is making a big impact in terms of modern. With Psychic Frog and Dark Blast, it's basically like make a giant frog on attack, draw you a bunch of cards. So Menace, Lifelink, Indestructible, 4/4. Can't attack or block unless there are 7 more cards in exile. Whenever 1 or more cards put into exile from graveyards or the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card and lose a life. So it's kind of a draw engine. In terms of the deck itself, you have a couple white sources to cast it, but with Insidious Roots, you make tokens. You also have Molt Tender, which plays really nice with Ketramos. So not only can it mill you cards, enabling your combo, it can also exile cards from your graveyard, which trigger Ketramos, which gives you mana. So it's like a mana dork. You have Osteomancer Adept, which lets you forge from your graveyard, lets you cast spells from your graveyard, and then triggers Ketramos, triggers Roots. You have the Overlord that mills you in. You have your Tyvar that mills you in again, and then Thrill Seeker can basically fling a creature at your opponent. So you can make really large Insidious Roots tokens and then fling it. This one's not on Soul Cauldron in the main, but sometimes you see Soul Cauldron. The Kowatli Scavenger, descend 4. When it enters battlefield, there are 4 more permanents return. So this is just kind of a regrowth effect, which is kind of cool. Sideboard, Haywire Might, Artifact Enchantment Hate for a lot of the graveyard like hate pieces. Soul Cauldron, a way to take advantage of counters. Graveyard Hate, Anoint, cheap removal. Bat can be hand hate. Diabolic Intent is a tutor effect that lets you play more of a toolbox sideboard. Go for the throw, cheap removal. Gix as Glissa, Preacher, so you can kind of shift more into just a mid-range deck if your opponent's going to be attacking your graveyard a lot. Skyfisher is removal, and then Harvester of Misery as kind of a sweeper for the go wide decks. You don't necessarily care if your creatures go to the graveyard because you're going to be playing Roots and stuff like that. So this deck here is an example of the Toolbox Bright Glass Gearhulk cage decks. This one is from Reward. They went 13 and 4 into like Mythic. So there's a green-white and there's a Bant version. The big thing with Gearhulk is they're played in like 3 to 4 depending on the composition of the deck. It allows you to play a toolbox element. So with the toolbox, you can get artifacts, enchantments, or creatures with 1 CMC. So you could play kind of things like the District Mascot comes in. If it has counters, it could be used to destroy artifacts, and it could saddle. Dusk Rose is removal. Haywire Might as artifact enchantment hate, similar with Insidious Fungus as enchantment hate. Mockingbird could copy your Gearhulk, so you can kind of chain them together. Some of them are playing Pixie in here. Some of them are playing main board Basilisk Collar. So that's kind of ideas there. You have your Collector's Cage package that lets you cheat out your Overlords potentially. Your 3-drops that make multiple bodies also added in. Authority of the Consuls against the aggressive decks. Also, some of the decks are playing the enchantment line just as a tutorable one with Gearhawk. Elspeth Smite, cheap removal. Ghost Vacuum, Soul Guide Lantern could be found with the Gearhawks as well. So you have Graveyard Hate that's tutorable. Spell Pierce is cheap disruption along with Negate, particularly against Sunfall decks. You have Invasion that can slow them down a bit. You have Sheltered by Ghost versus the aggressive decks. Cthulhu's Flanker, Graveyard Hate, also a reasonable play after the Sunfall, and then split up as a cheap sweeper in the creature mirrors. And then lastly, a bit of a spicy one. This is from Trason. They went 38 and 14 into almost top 1,000 Mythic. This is a wild one. It is Annie Joins Up Legends. You have Plaza of Heroes, Cavern of Souls. You got some new Verges in here. But the deck is looking to use Annie Joins Up to double. So it's both removal and then doubles ETB effects. Beza obviously gains you potentially double life, double creatures, double cards. You have Dragonhawk's Tempest, so it enters or attacks. You exile X cards, you can deal damage. Roxanne doubling triggers. Elish Norton to double the double. Then you have Eternal Wander, Tali on the top end. So kind of big mana deck. Goose Mother can make you a whole bunch of food tokens, and then it gives you some card advantage. You have Overgrown Zealot as a mana dork that's a reasonable blocker, and then can ramp you up. Fuel the Flames as a cheap sweeper. Deals 2 damage to each creature, can cycle when you don't need it, Soul Partition. So really relying on kind of the top end in this deck. You have the Calarara as another big blocker, Graveyard Hate and Rest in Peace, Scorching Dragonfire's cheap removal, Lauren Artifact Enchantment Hate, Jace for like Domain or Mono White matchups, you mill them out, Elish Norn for ETB effects, Ride's End as a cheap removal spell. For the most part, this is going to be 2 mana, exile target creature or vehicle. Kali for like the mid-range value decks, you just kind of outpace them. And then Cease Desist, destroy all artifacts, enchantments. So this is predominantly for like the domain matchup, stuff like that. It also could be a Graveyard Hate if you need it. So a little bit flexible of a card. I'm actually curious to see what their Gruul. So they've only played Gruul once, which is kind of interesting. Against the Pixie decks, they're 4-2. Against Esper, they're 4-0. They're kind of outvaluing them, which is kind of cool just to see with that deck there. That's it for the week. Let me know what you've been playing, what you've been liking, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for watching.